He pulled over and got out of his car, and at this point he was wearing his police belt and it had handcuffs attached to it. It was clear that he was going to be acting as a police officer. And when they looked inside his car, forensic examiners found little tiny bits of a SIM card, and they were later identified to be the broken pieces of Sarah's SIM card. And they also found a speck of blood on one of the seats in that car, as well as some of Wayne's semen. And he says that he went to a sex worker a little while back and he underpaid this sex worker, and then that led to a gang being after him. This is Humans. True stories about the most intriguing parts of human behaviour. The good, the bad, and the downright horrific. Today's case is going to be about the murder of Sarah Everard. If you live in the UK, or likely not actually, you will probably have heard of her name. That's because her murder sparked a huge discussion on women's safety, especially because her murder was committed by a man who was serving as a Metropolitan Police officer. And I don't really like to spend a lot of time on the perpetrator, so I'll be talking a lot about Sarah and a lot about the crime, but I will be talking a little bit about Wayne Couzens, the person who killed her. I think it's important to try and understand a little bit about why he's such a piece of shit and what might have contributed to the way he turned out. So Sarah Everard was born in 1987. So as of 2021, when this crime happened, she was 33 years old. And she was born in Surrey, and she only spent a few years of her childhood there because she very quickly moved to York with her family. Her dad, Jeremy, is a university professor, and he got a job as a professor of electronics at the University of York. So her whole family moved up there, and that's her dad, Jeremy, her mum, Susan, who works in charity, her older brother, James, and her older sister, Katie. And she and her siblings were really, really close. And when they moved to York, they just had the best time. I mean, York is renowned for being beautiful. It has castles, it has beautiful architecture. And Sarah went to Fulford School, which is just about a 10-minute drive from the city centre. Sarah was a really good student. She excelled at primary level and secondary level, and she worked really hard. She was always top of her class. So when it came to sort of deciding what university she wanted to go to, she knew she wanted to shoot high. And she actually was accepted into Durham University, which is a really good university here in the UK. It ranks number 6 out of 130. So being accepted there is a huge achievement. So Sarah moved to Durham and she was really popular there. She made a number of friends and she became particularly close with a woman called Rose Woolard. Now, they weren't studying the same thing at the time. Sarah was studying human geography and Rose was studying to be a teacher, but Sarah sort of loved that. She loved that Rose was wanting to help educate the younger generation, and they became really close. And then during their time there at university, unfortunately, Sarah learnt that Rose had lost her mum, and she called her and said, "I'm here for you. Whatever time it is, night or day, just call me, let me know if you need me, and I can be there." And that wasn't a big deal for Sarah. That was just normal. That was the type of person she was. And then in 2008, Sarah graduated from Durham University, and she'd had a brilliant time there. She'd earned brilliant grades. She had incredible prospects in front of her, but she decided that she didn't want to go straight into the world of working, and actually she wanted to do a bit of exploring and travel the world. And so she did. She visited Vietnam and Cambodia and India, amongst many other places. And when she was finished travelling, she moved back to England, but rather than moving to Durham or back to York, she actually decided to take the leap and go to London. And this was sort of a logical next step for her. Her brother and sister were already in London, and she knew that the opportunities for her personally would be much better in London, especially in terms of climbing the career ladder. So Sarah moved to Brixton Hill in South London, and because Sarah was incredibly intelligent, she was also proactive and motivated, and she had the grades to back it up. So she had no problem scoring a job pretty immediately as a marketing account manager. And from there onwards, Sarah worked her way up the career ladder, and she worked at a number of PR agencies and worked up through to senior account manager and eventually to group account director. And then in 2013, she decided that she wanted to do another travel stint. And she was really passionate about her career, but she knew if she didn't go now, she probably wouldn't go in the future. So she took 6 months out of work and she actually travelled South America. And when she'd finished doing that, she felt really satisfied with the places that she'd seen and the places she'd visited and all of the experiences she'd gained. And so she moved back to London and began working life as normal again. And then in 2020, so once Sarah had been working for a total of 12 years on and off, she was very experienced, she was offered a job at a marketing digital agency in Holborn. Holborn is in the borough of Camden, and it's really an incredible place to work. It's especially appealing to a lot of young professionals. There's a lot going on there, and this was no doubt very exciting for Sarah. So Sarah started work and she fitted in really well at this new job. She was known by her work colleagues as having a really caring attitude towards them, which in this sort of fast-paced work environment wasn't always the case. So that really stuck out to people. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, her family and friends would attest to this as well and say that she never had a bad word to say about anyone. In the back of Sarah's mind, her mum Susan would later say that although nothing was in motion, nothing was happening just yet, Sarah always knew that she wanted to have a family of her own, and this new job would allow for her to actually start thinking about saving for buying a house. Rent prices in London are ridiculous, and there was no way up to this point that she was able to properly start saving. So this new job represented a lot for her, a lot to do with her future. And speaking of her future, during her time in London, she actually met this person, this guy called Josh Louth, and the two of them very quickly realised that they had a lot in common, and they actually started dating. And Josh lived just down the road in Brixton Hill from Sarah, so it sort of felt a bit like fate when they met and started dating. And Josh was similarly incredibly ambitious, and he had been at Nottingham University studying chemistry for 4 years prior to meeting Sarah. And when he and Sarah met, they realised that they just sort of spurred each other on in terms of ambition and career, and they were really happy together. And then in January of 2021, so sort of back to present day, Boris Johnson announced a third national lockdown to prevent the spread of coronavirus. And much like the first 2 lockdowns, this meant that people were asked to stay home, and they were allowed to meet other people if they were in this kind of support bubble thing. But to be honest, this third lockdown was a bit confusing and was a bit wishy-washy. I was a bit confused about what was like actual law and what was guidelines and what was like recommended. So because it was the third time this had happened, it was a bit confusing in places. Just 5 days before this roadmap was introduced, Sarah Everard went to visit her friend in Clapham. Sarah left her house early that evening and headed straight to Sainsbury's in Brixton Hill, and CCTV shows her entering dressed in trainers, navy blue trousers that had this sort of diamond pattern on them, a green raincoat and a white beanie hat. And she buys a bottle of wine, and then she heads for her friend's house in Leithwaite Road. This is only about a 40-minute walk from that Sainsbury's, and to get to Leithwaite Road, Sarah would have probably had to walk across Clapham Common. That Leithwaite Road itself is very nice. It's full of very nice houses. It's very expensive. The average house price there is over £750,000, so it's a nice area. And Sarah went there and she had a really nice evening with her friend, and they had dinner and they drank some wine, and they wrapped it up at around about 9 o'clock that evening. And so Sarah left the house and she left through the back gate, which went out onto a road. And the walk back to her house would take her back through Clapham Common and past that Sainsbury's on Brixton Hill and back to her house in about 50 minutes. And during the beginning of this walk, she got her phone out and she actually called her boyfriend Josh. And they spoke for about 15 minutes. They spoke about how their day was, how they were doing, and also they were making plans for the next day because they were going to meet up. The entire call lasted just about 15 minutes, and at 9:28 p.m. that evening, Sarah's phone stopped receiving any WhatsApp messages, any calls, anything like that. And at the time, it was unclear whether her phone was turned off or whether it had run out of battery. But either way, there were no more signal bounces from Sarah's phone. The next day, Sarah didn't turn up for a meeting at work, and after a few hours, Josh realised that he hadn't heard from her at all. It was uncharacteristic for Sarah to miss work, full stop, but especially so because she hadn't actually let anyone know that she wasn't going to be in. It's not like she called to say, I'm poorly, or I've got a doctor's appointment, anything like that. It was a completely unexplained and unexpected absence. When Sarah didn't turn up to meet Josh like they'd arranged the day before, he immediately knew that something was seriously wrong, and so he didn't waste any time in reporting her as missing to the police. The case was immediately classed as a missing persons case, and word was put out all over social media with a picture of Sarah and asking to keep a lookout for her. The next day, the Met's Specialist Crime Unit took over the case. So this was quite an escalation from what the day before had been a fairly mild missing persons case. She'd only been missing for a matter of hours. And it was around this time that Sarah's mum and dad were obviously incredibly worried, and so decided to travel down from York to London, which is about 220 miles. They joined the search for Sarah and they put up posters with the picture of her in the same green jacket that she'd last been seen in, and they also retraced her steps that she would have taken on her walk home to see if they could find any sort of evidence or clues as to where she might be. By the 5th of March, so 2 days after Sarah had last been seen, there were over 120 phone calls that had come in to the police service reporting sightings or tips on where Sarah might have been. And the police had also gone to 750 homes in the area and knocked on doors and sort of done questioning and asking people if they'd seen her. And on that same day, an appeal was launched to ask for CCTV footage or dash cam footage or Ring doorbell footage to see if they could try and track Sarah's last movements before she disappeared. During this investigation, it was revealed that the CCTV footage from an estate agent near Sarah's house, where she would have had to walk past to go home, showed no footage of Sarah ever having passed by on her way back home that evening, which means she never returned. From when she left her friend's house in Leithwaite Road to coming back home, somewhere along the way, she disappeared. The following day, on the 6th of March, reports actually came in that London Search and Rescue were spotted in the Clapham Common area searching the pond. By the 7th of March, police search and rescue teams confirmed that nothing had been found in the Clapham Common area or in the pond that they'd been searching. And around this time, a 100-metre area of Poinders Road was cordoned off, and that area was somewhere Sarah would have walked through to get home, and they said that there may have been some sort of clues that would be vital in helping locate Sarah. They also began searching bins nearby and lifting drain covers, and it was quickly becoming clear to Sarah's family and friends and the entire world that Sarah had not gone willingly to wherever she'd gone to. She had been taken forcefully. One of Sarah's uncles, Nick, pleaded with whoever had done this to just let Sarah go, and if they weren't going to do that, just let her be in contact with them in some way to let them know that she was okay. Sarah's boyfriend Josh updated his Facebook status, quote, "Today, more than ever, we miss our strong, beautiful friend. #International Women's Day. end quote. Over the next few days, police sniffer dogs searched the route that Sarah would have taken home, and further investigation into that area revealed that a number of women had reported being followed along that road in the months prior to Sarah's disappearance. During this time, police released a statement urging women in the area to stay extra vigilant. Superintendent Chris Wright from the Metropolitan Police Service said, quote, "I know that Sarah's disappearance is weighing on people's minds, and the local community is of course concerned about her and may even feel worried. I want them to know that they should expect to see more police officers on patrol in the area as we continue to search for Sarah and talk with the community. If you want to approach them about any concerns you have, please do so. We're here to support the community and we genuinely want to help in any way we can," end quote. Obviously, knowing what we know now, that piece of advice is quite a sad and scary bit of irony, because meanwhile, CCTV recordings were coming in by the dozens, and what they showed on the night of Sarah's disappearance was chilling. So during the first half of her walk, as we know, Sarah was on the phone to her boyfriend Josh, and she was picked up on CCTV footage on Bowood Road. That's just about 5 minutes away from where she started her journey at her friend's house, and on this CCTV footage there's no one following her, there's no one around her, it's just her on her own. A camera then picked Sarah up at 9:28 p.m. on Cavendish Road, and then again 2 minutes later on Poinders Road. This area is about a 22-minute walk away from her friend's house and about 20 minutes away from her house, so she's around halfway through her walking journey home. It's thought that she would take this route rather than the back roads route, because it's thought of as safer. There are street lights, there's lots of cars, it's sort of a busy road and generally is thought of as a much safer walking route. 3 minutes later, a camera in an unmarked police car captures Sarah walking along that same road. This was 9:32 p.m. 3 minutes later, a bus camera picks up Sarah a little bit further down Poinders Road. This time she stood on the street outside a white Vauxhall Astra, and she's not alone. This footage shows two figures standing just past a parked Vauxhall Astra, white Vauxhall Astra, and it's got its hazard lights flashing. And we can see from this footage that one of those people is definitely Sarah Everard, and the other person at this point was an unknown male. And then another 3 minutes later, a different bus camera captures the same image, but this time the parked Vauxhall Astra doors are open, and this same camera from this bus actually captures the number plate of the Vauxhall Astra, which is incredibly lucky because the bus camera before only got a sort of blurry image and couldn't identify what number plate that was. Detectives were then able to use that footage to then trace the car. They very quickly discovered that this was a hired car, and it was hired from nowhere nearby. It was actually 75 miles away in a place called Dover. They were given the details for this car that they had on record, and the name that showed up was a shock to everyone involved. This person who had rented the car was a man called Wayne Cousins, and he was a serving Metropolitan Police officer. Wayne Cousins was born in 1972 in Dover, and he initially worked at his dad's garage before seeing his younger brother actually go into police work. And when he saw that happen, he decided that he wanted to do the same, and so he followed in his little brother's footsteps. He first volunteered as a special sergeant in Kent and then as an army reservist, which is where he learnt to work with firearms. In 2006, Wayne met his wife on the internet, and the two of them married and had 2 children, a little girl and a little boy. In 2011, he started working for the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, where he would essentially guard the country's atomic power. He eventually transferred to work for the Metropolitan Police Service, and it's at this point that I do think it's worth pointing out his journey to work would have taken 2 hours each way. It was a 4-hour round trip, and I think if you are doing something for your career where that's required and you're an ambitious person, then I totally see that happening. I don't think that's necessarily like an odd thing. But I think knowing what we know now, I think we have to consider what length this man would go to gain ultimate control and power, essentially. During his time with the Met, he actually worked in a safer neighbourhood team. And it was around this time that he also started going to the gym very regularly. And he reportedly began taking steroids and developed an extreme porn addiction. He would wear his police belt and handcuffs whilst not on duty. And at this time, he also started paying for sex workers, which obviously his wife didn't know about at that time. And then in March 2020, the UK went into lockdown number 1 for coronavirus. And the next year and a bit were full of different types of lockdowns, regulations, rules and guidelines. And because of this, police were tasked with taking part in COVID patrols in order to sort of regulate and enforce these rules that had come into play. And Wayne Couzens did participate in a number of COVID patrols during his time with the police force. And so in March 2021, it is completely plausible that Wayne Couzens might have been doing a COVID patrol. And during this time, he was obviously feeling some kind of way, because after he'd rented that Vauxhall Astra, or organised to do that, he actually took himself in his regular car and went to a McDonald's drive-through. And when he was there, he actually flashed two of the female members of staff. And I spoke to a listener of REDRUM podcast about this, because she said that a family member of hers actually worked there at the time, and they had Wayne's number plate, they had his bank card, and they informed the police of this. But unfortunately, nothing was done until after Sarah's disappearance. And I know that an indecent exposure charge and a murder charge are very different, and someone who has an indecent exposure charge is not necessarily going to go on to commit murder. But a number of reviews have found that nearly, quote, 10% of flashers escalated their behaviour to more serious sexual offences, end quote. So flashing and indecent exposure is punishable by up to 2 years in prison, but this rarely actually happens. Last year in England and Wales, there were over 10,000 cases of indecent exposure reported, but only half of them actually went to trial. There is a general fear of not being believed or not being taken seriously in cases like this, and given those numbers, it's easy to see why that is. Criminologist and Professor Jane Monckton Smith said, quote, "Flashing is an act of sexual aggression. It's a red flag behaviour. If someone has flashing in their past, I'd expect there to be problems in their future. It might not lead directly to rape, but it may lead to things like domestic abuse, coercive control, stalking, and sexual violence," end quote. Over the last 4 years, over 200 people who were sentenced to serve time for rape already had indecent exposure charges against them. And 8 people who already had indecent exposure charges against them went on to murder. So there is a definite link here, but it's easy to see why everyone around Wayne Couzens, his family, his friends, his colleagues, were fooled. A colleague of his from his dad's garage said, quote, "I was the only lady who worked there because it was a garage, but he was always polite and respectful towards me. The Wayne I remember was kind and thoughtful, so when he was arrested, I was absolutely stunned. Something must have happened to him after he joined the police." And her husband said, quote, "He didn't come from a dysfunctional family. His father was a well-liked local businessman and family man. His uncle Roy was a prominent member of the Dover lifeboat team. His younger brother also became a policeman. They were all respectable members of the community. How he turned out to do what he did is a mystery." And of course, he was living under the guise of this happy family man, and he would return every night to his wife and his 2 children, one aged 10 and one aged 8 at the time of Sarah's disappearance. And then on the 1st of March, so just 2 days before Sarah disappeared, Wayne's brother-in-law spoke to him on Skype, And he said, quote, "He seemed fine when we spoke to him. There were no issues at all. He is an extremely warm person, very polite and calm. I've never seen him treating my sister or children badly." End quote. And so then on the 2nd of March, Wayne started his shift at 7 p.m. and he finished the next morning at 7 a.m, so on the 3rd of March. And later that day, Wayne told his wife that he would be working again that evening, which we obviously know is completely untrue. So at around 4:45 p.m, Wayne actually goes and gets this rented Vauxhall Astra car from the Enterprise, and he takes that from Dover and he makes his way immediately to London. At 8 p.m, Wayne stopped at a Tesco in Kensington. Tesco's like a huge supermarket here in the UK, and when he was there he picked up 14 hairbands, and the prosecution would later say, quote, "These were bought for the purposes of the planned kidnap and rape, whether as restraints or to be used during sex acts." End quote. Then he drove around South London looking for a lone female to abduct, and it was around 9:30 p.m. that he was driving along Poinders Road at the same time as Sarah, and he saw her on her own, and he saw that as his opportunity. He pulled over and got out of his car, and at this point he was wearing his police belt and it had handcuffs attached to it. It was clear that he was going to be acting as a police officer. He then pulled out his warrant card and showed it to Sarah, and then he arrested her falsely on the grounds of breaking COVID restrictions. At 9:34 p.m, he handcuffs her, and a person passing by in their car actually saw this and noticed what she thought was a sort of undercover police operation happening. And this passerby noticed that Sarah didn't seem to be kicking up a fuss. She wasn't resisting the arrest at all, and thought that Sarah had obviously just done something wrong and was being arrested in line with the law. Little did she know, she was actually witnessing Sarah's abduction. At 9:37 p.m, Wayne has got Sarah into the car and he pulls the seatbelt over her. He then closes the door, makes sure that they're locked, and gets into the driver's seat. And once there, he starts the 75-mile journey back to Dover. When he arrives back in Dover, he makes his way to this non-residential area where he'd actually parked his family Seat car many hours earlier, ready for this moment. And this is very late at night. This is sort of after 11 p.m. and he transfers Sarah over to this family car, and then CCTV actually captures his family car exiting out of North Military Road at 11:43 p.m. And he drives towards Shepherdswell, which is a village in Dover, and his mobile phone data actually places him there for quite a while. He's there from 11:53 p.m. until 3 minutes to 1, and it's believed that during this time he raped and murdered Sarah. It's believed that he strangled her with his police belt. Then his car is picked up on an automatic number plate recognition system at 2:31 a.m, driving back into Dover. And just 3 minutes later, CCTV captures him at a BP service station, and there he buys a bottle of water, a Lucozade and an apple before leaving again. The next sighting of his car is at 3:21 a.m, and it's by Hodes Wood, which is an area that we'll come back to a number of times. This area, Hodes Wood, is in Ashford near Kent, and it's thought that this first time his car's seen there is when he's dumping Sarah's body there. And his car's tracked there again twice more through the night. Then at 7:30 a.m, he drives back to his Enterprise hired car, the white Vauxhall Astra, and he switches over. He gets in the hired car and then he drives it back to the Enterprise shop so he can drop it off. He then arrives at a Costa Coffee shop at 8:14 a.m, and on the CCTV footage here you can see him standing by the till, and he orders a coconut hot chocolate and a Bakewell tart. And as you see him here, you can see him sort of fidgeting his hands and acting in a sort of nervy way. He then drove about 20 minutes away to Sandwich in Kent, And when he's there, he gets out of his car and he has already broken up Sarah's EE SIM card, and he takes that along with her phone and throws them both over into a river. At 11:05 a.m, Wayne is seen on CCTV footage at a BP service station. And while he's there, he buys a salted caramel latte and also purchases a petrol can. And then he fills it up with 6 litres of petrol and he pays for it and leaves. Moments later, he's seen on CCTV at a McDonald's where he buys an extra large value meal. And then he makes his way back to Hodes Wood where he takes the petrol, and from what we understand, he then pours it on Sarah's body, which at this point he'd placed in a fridge, and then lights her body on fire. And on the 5th of March, which was the same day that Sarah's parents came down from York, we know that Wayne Couzens was acting pretty normally, almost as if nothing had happened. He'd already booked those few days after the event off of work, so premeditation is sort of obvious at this point. But some of the things he did are quite chilling given what's just happened. There's a recording of him calling the local vets about his dog, and I'm going to play it, but as you'll hear, he's acting pretty normally.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could book my dog in for the vet so I can have a discussion about issues, please. It's Couzens, Couzens. Is Maddie. That's the one. No, that's fine. I work shift work, so either, let me think, but would it be possible the Friday the 12th, sometime after 3:30? That would be brilliant. Yep, no, that's fine. We think she's suffering from, separation anxiety.
He's planning things to do a week later, so it's clear he has complete confidence that he's not under suspicion for Sarah's murder. Also, the tone of this call, he is completely at ease. He's relaxed. There's no sense of any kind of remorse for what he's done. He's just getting on with his week as normal. After this phone call, he leaves his house and he heads to B&Q, where he buys 2 large builder's bags, which it's thought were going to be used to transport Sarah's body. He's seen in Hodes Wood later that afternoon, and then on the 7th of March, so 4 days after Sarah has disappeared, Wayne tells his family they're going on a little family trip, and he takes them to Hodes Wood so that his little boy and little girl can play just meters away from where Sarah's body is lying. He was due to be back at work on the 8th of March, but he called his supervisor and said that he was too ill to work, so needed to stay home. I assume because of all of the coverage of Sarah's case at this point, Wayne probably felt quite nervous. Good. He probably wasn't expecting there to be so much noise surrounding Sarah's disappearance. He just picked a random girl walking alone on a street. He had no idea that it would become this huge manhunt. Then on the evening of the 9th of March, Wayne wipes all of his phone settings back to factory reset. And then at 7:50 p.m. that evening, on the 9th of March, an emergency police interview was authorised. And this was authorised because at this point, there was some hope that Sarah was still alive, and an emergency police interview basically in the UK means that they can go in without a solicitor present. And obviously Wayne, being a police officer, he knows his rights, he knows that he's entitled to a solicitor, but in this kind of interview, there doesn't need to be one present and they can question him immediately. I'll link the video in the description box below of this police interview, but basically what happens is they ask Wayne if he knows Sarah and they show him a picture and he says no. They then ask him if he knows what has happened to her, and initially he says no, other than what he's heard on the news. But eventually he begins to talk about being in financial trouble and needing to sort himself out. And he says that he went to a sex worker a little while back and he underpaid this sex worker, and then that led to a gang being after him. He says that the gang threatened to hurt him and his family if he didn't do what they said. and what they apparently said to do was to pick up girls. But the officer questioning Wayne asks him how they were in contact, and Wayne sort of avoids this question a number of times. And then eventually he turns to the officer and says that they would just turn up. First they would turn up at his house, and then they would just sort of turn up wherever and whenever. He said that on the night he abducted Sarah, he got her into his car and then he started driving, and he was flashed by a Mercedes van. So he pulled over into a lay-by and he got Sarah out of the car, and then these 3 Eastern European men apparently got out of this van, got Sarah, took her into their van, and they just drove off, and he never saw them again. Wayne goes on to give a complete description of these 3 men, as well as the location where he supposedly pulled over and the exchange happened. Obviously, we know this is complete BS, and the police knew that as well. And so they continued questioning him, and eventually his story started breaking down, and they got to a place where he actually gave up a really important piece of information, and that was that he owned this little plot of land in Hodes Wood. They also, at this point, had the mobile phone data from Wayne's phone. So they went out that way to where his phone had pinged on the night of Sarah's disappearance to try and find some evidence of where she might be. And then it was on the 10th of March that Sarah's body was located, and it was found to be just 100 yards away from that plot of land that Wayne owned in Hodes Wood. Her body was so badly burnt that she had to be identified by dental records. Wayne's car was seized and he was taken into custody. And when they looked inside his car, forensic examiners found little tiny bits of a SIM card, and they were later identified to be the broken pieces of Sarah's SIM card. And they also found a speck of blood on one of the seats in that car, as well as some of Wayne's semen. There was no doubt that this gang story was a complete lie, and they had a lot of evidence to back that up. Whilst Wayne was in prison awaiting trial, Wayne deliberately smashed his head on the toilet bowl, and he was actually found in his cell unconscious. He was rushed to hospital and treated, and he was absolutely fine. So they brought him back and did conduct that interview. And in June 2021, Wayne did actually plead guilty to the rape, abduction and murder of Sarah Everard, so he avoided a trial. After the details of Wayne being a police officer and being in this position came out into the public, people were really, really worried, and there were questions around whether the vetting process was thorough enough. How had he been able to become a police officer in the first place and then keep that position of power? When he was trained to carry a gun and served at a high security nuclear site, he was actually subjected to one of the highest levels of security checks, and he did pass that. Ultimately, the Metropolitan Police Service defended their process and their decisions and said that there was nothing in Wayne's background to have stopped him passing this vetting process. And right now, the Independent Office for Police Conduct is investigating into whether those claims of indecent exposure weren't looked into thoroughly enough and what that all means. But that has been the same since Wayne's arrest, and it's now the 3rd of February 2022, and nothing has changed. And that's a long time, so whether anything will progress, I don't know. If it does, I'll let you know, I'll keep you updated. But as of right now, nothing's changed. The Metropolitan Police offered some advice at this point and said that any women experiencing any kind of communication with a male officer that they don't believe is genuine should call 999 or shout for help or flag down a passing bus. Obviously there was huge uproar because of this. A Reclaim the Streets vigil was organised as a response to the Met's handling of this situation, but the request for the vigil was actually refused by the Met, so the people who organised this protest took it higher up to the High Court, but the police still refused to support or facilitate the vigil as legal. Many women attended a more sort of virtual Reclaim the Streets protest, which took place online and in their doorways. But there were still a number of women who did attend that in-person protest, and they were met with violence from Met police officers. The organisers set up a GoFundMe page which was raising money for Rosa Fund, a charity that supports people who have been affected and had their lives devastated by male violence. And that, at the time of this recording, has raised over £500,000. I'll leave the link in the description box down below if you want to go take a look at it, take a look at their cause or donate to it. In October 2018, Karen Ingala Smith wrote an article and listed 81 names of women who had been killed at the hands of a man during the year 2021. And that was only up to October. So I think actually the entirety of 2021, there were 125 women that were killed by men in the UK. Lots of the women in this article you probably wouldn't have heard of, and Sarah's case got an awful lot of media coverage because of who she is, because she's a white woman, but also because her case was one that involved a serving Met police officer. And there are people on that list that have had no media coverage at all. One person who died just a little while after Sarah in similar circumstances, that it was an unknown male to her and she was killed in a park in London. That woman's name is Sabina Nessa, and I'll be covering her case as soon as there's enough information available for it. I would implore you to just click that link. It's a Guardian article and I'll put it as the first link, and just have a read of these women's stories and what they went through, and most importantly, read their names and remember them. Sarah's family read victim impact statements, and Sarah's sister read this, quote, "You used your warrant card to trick my sister into your car. She sat in a car, handcuffed for hours. What could she have thought she had done wrong? What lies did you tell her? When did she realise she wasn't gonna survive the night?" And her mum said, quote, "I wonder when she realised she was in mortal danger. I wonder what her murderer said to her. In her last hours, she was faced with brutality and terror, alone with someone intent on doing her harm. The thought of it is unbearable." Sarah was handcuffed, unable to defend herself, and there was no one to rescue her. She spent her last hours on this earth with the very worst of humanity. She lost her life because Wayne Couzens wanted to satisfy his perverted desires. It is a ridiculous reason. It is nonsensical. How could he value a human life so cheaply? I cannot comprehend it. I am incandescent with rage at the thought of it. There wasn't obviously a trial in this case, but at the sentencing, the judge's closing remarks were this, quote, "Sarah Everard was a wholly blameless victim of a grotesquely executed series of circumstances that culminated in her death and the disposal of her body. She was simply walking home. Sarah Everard's state of mind and what she had to endure would have been as bleak and agonising as it is possible to imagine." This is Humans. True stories about the most intriguing parts of human behaviour, the good, the bad, and the downright horrific. As I said in the last video, I am Grace. Hi. I host and write REDRUM True Crime Podcast. So if you like true crime or you like podcasts, you might like that. So I'll leave a link in the description box down below. If you want to hop over there, you can listen to 44 episodes, possibly 43 episodes at this point. Yeah, let me know what you think of that. And if you're from REDRUM and you're here, thanks for coming. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed. Enjoyed's the wrong word, but I hope you got something from this video. Bye.